The committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess of the committee at any time. Welcome to today's hearing, which is entitled An Overview of the Budget Proposal for the National Aeronautics and Space Administration for Fiscal Year 2024. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Good afternoon. I want to welcome everyone to today's hearing to review the administration's proposed budget request for NASA for fiscal year 2024. And I'd like to thank you for joining us before us today, Administrator Nelson. The administration requested $27.2 billion for NASA, which would be an increase of $1.8 billion over current funding levels, or about a 7% increase. The submission of the administration's budget request kicks off the annual appropriations process. As authorizers, we play an important role in this process by establishing priorities and policy direction for NASA. In our oversight capacity, we ensure the agency is operating consistently with congressional intent, and this oversight helps ensure our colleagues at the Appropriations Committee can feel justified in spending our limited dollars on these efforts. That is why one of the top priorities of this Congress is the passage of a comprehensive NASA authorization bill. It's been more than 6 years since a comprehensive authorization bill was signed into law, and that's far too long for an agency of NASA's importance. Today's hearing will inform our deliberations as we draft this bill. It's also a chance to reflect on NASA's many recent accomplishments and consider what we can learn from these successes. I know I speak for everyone in the room when I say how proud I am that I was to see the first, like everyone else, the first successful launch of Artemis I last November. Returning humans to the moon is one of our highest priorities, and this was an incredible first step towards that goal. I also continue to be amazed by the stunning images and groundbreaking science produced by the James Webb Space Telescope. We're seeing farther back in history than ever before, and I'm excited to see what we'll learn next. I'm interested in the success of these missions and of NASA's other work, and I'm mindful that future achievements require hard work for both NASA and this committee. Importantly, Congress and NASA must work together to ensure Artemis remains on track to return humans to the lunar surface. That's why I'm interested in understanding why the budget request would delay Artemis IV from 2027 to 2028. We must also be certain that missions in NASA's science portfolio remain on time and within budget. As impressive as the images and science produced by the James Webb Space Telescope might be, we cannot forget that it was billions of dollars over budget and years behind schedule. Because of those massive cost and time overruns, the telescope came at the expense of many other worthy science missions. And yet, here we are again, seeing how cost estimates ballooning for a single mission, the Mars sample return, can negatively impact other missions. Because of these overflowing costs, NASA has been forced to make difficult choices in their science portfolio. It postponed a select mission to Venus indefinitely, paused a flagship heliophysics mission, and delayed launch of an important asteroid detection spacecraft. If this trend continues, then NASA may have to make difficult decisions to postpone or cancel future missions. This is unacceptable, and we must do better. So I look forward to hearing how NASA intends to ensure that current science missions remain on schedule and within budget. And there are many other areas where we need to review the agency's activities, from NASA's works on aeronautics to its development of new technologies to allow us to explore further into the solar system, to the transitioning to new orbital platforms in low Earth orbit. There's no shortage of work for the committee in the coming months. I'll remind my colleagues that we are not the only country interested in returning to the moon and traveling beyond. China has made no secret of its ambitions to also have a sustained human presence on the moon. I want to be clear that I will do everything within my power to ensure that the next astronauts on the moon are Americans. And I want to welcome Administrator Nelson back to this hearing room, where he spent many years as a member of this committee. And I look forward to his testimony and a productive discussion about NASA's plans for the future. And with that, I yield back my time and recognize the ranking member from California for an opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Administrator Nelson. It's good to see you here today. You know, for the 11th consecutive year, NASA has been named the best place to work in the federal government among large agencies. And I want to congratulate you, Administrator Nelson, your team, and all of the NASA civil servants for creating a leading workplace in the federal government. You know, people are the core of NASA's mission, and I want to thank them for their talent, for their dedication, and for their service. What you're doing is truly exceptional. There's a lot to celebrate in NASA's work. The James Webb Space Telescope, which began scientific operations, they're returning mind-blowing science. The double asteroid reduction test demonstrated for the first time that we have the ability to deflect an asteroid. That will be a very welcome tool should we need to use it. NASA also launched the Surface Water and Ocean Topography mission that's going to give us unprecedented detail of the planet's freshwater and oceans, something we need as we explore climate change and its impact on all of us. And of course, Artemis, which the chairman has already discussed. The President's request for this fiscal year, I'd say, is a winner, a big bump up, but I would be remiss if I didn't express my concern about the bill that the House passed yesterday, an estimated 22% reduction across all civilian agencies, and I am concerned that this could have a bad impact on NASA. Would future Artemis missions need to be delayed, halted, even eliminated? Would missions essential to observing our Earth and collecting data on natural hazards and climate change, would they be delayed? One of the most complex scientific undertakings ever initiated to return samples from the Martian surface, would that be possible? So those are a few examples that cause me great concern. Such reductions could affect also, I think, our universities, industry, our economy, the many high-paying jobs that our investments produce. NASA not only is a space agency, but it's a promoter of economic development as a side matter, and that's important to all of us. I know also that NASA is known for its cooperation and collaboration with other nations, and I'm worried that that might impact, these reductions might impact that capacity. We can't give up leadership in the international space efforts, and we cannot cede our leadership to China when it comes to space. So now more than ever, we need you, NASA. We need your leadership, your expertise, and I'm hoping to hear from you, Administrator Nelson, on what you need from us. The chairman and I work very closely together. I have deep respect for him, as you know, so I'm hoping that with all of us working together, we can end up with a win for the space program and NASA. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Let me introduce our witness for today's hearing. Bill Nelson has served as the 14th administrator for the National Aeronautics and Space Administration since May of 2021. Administrator Nelson has worked in public office for over 4 decades, including 30 years in Congress where he represented Florida in both chambers. And during this time, Administrator Nelson chaired the Science Committee's Space, Science, and Applications Subcommittee for 6 years. So we want to thank you for being here. And with a slight deviation of normal custom, Mr. Director, would you like a moment of personal privilege before we begin your testimony?
Yes, sir. As a matter of fact, there are many very, very favorable, heartfelt memories from this room. I have served with, on the portraits on the walls, starting with Don Fuqua, Bob Rowe, all the way around, have served either in the House or the Senate with every one of those. And these are some extraordinary people, and each of them have their handprint on the nation's space policy, and I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful for the leadership that each of them gave. Don Fuqua was the big chairman when I was here, and I appreciate the opportunity to be with y'all. I want to give the committee a gift, and it is of historical significance. It is a recognition back that a lot of the program that we have going on now was set, chiseled into law in 2010 in the NASA authorization bill of 2010. It was bipartisan. It was Kay Bailey Hutchinson and me in the Senate. It passed the Senate unanimously. It came over here on the last day of the session before the August break. Fortunately, the majority leader, who did not want to take the Senate bill but said, okay, he said, but you got to pass it on the special order calendar. And of course, that needed a 2/3 vote. And of course, at the beginning of the day, we didn't have the vote. 2 members of the House, one of whom is still in the House, Dutch Ruppersberger, and John Culberson from Texas, took me by the hand and took me around the House floor for the entire day. And by the time that it passed, about 11 o'clock at night, we not only had the 2/3 vote, we had a 3/4 vote. That bill set us off on the course that we're on, with a public-private partnership with international partners, corporate commercial partners, starting the commercial program, and a significant nod to science. Unbeknownst to me, when Artemis flew beyond the moon 40,000 miles deeper than any human-rated spacecraft, Orion, had ever gone in the test flight before we put our crew, which has now been named, a crew of 4, 3 Americans and 1 Canadian, on Artemis II, which should go at the end of next year. Unbeknownst to me, they put 4 copies of the law that are signed by the president and signed by the speaker, and I have one of those 4 to give to you all today. So this engraved part of the bill is, not only has it flown 270,000 miles from Earth, but along with it, this American flag, a picture of Artemis at its farthest point, where it is taking a selfie photograph of itself, looking back, and what's in the background? The moon, 40,000 miles from the spacecraft, and there is home, the bright blue marble, 270,000 miles from the spacecraft. So we wanted you, Mr. Chairman, and the committee to have one of the copies that has flown in space.
I can say enthusiastically that the ranking member and I are very pleased to accept that on behalf of the committee.
And so the 2 of you have already given my opening comments. You've named just what's happened in the last 2 years, for example. The only thing that wasn't mentioned was the rover on Mars.
And Mr. Chairman, for the record, following House procedure, you're recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony. Please proceed, sir.
Well, since you all gave my speech for me, I'll turn to questions, but just to say that NASA is a place where it makes the impossible possible. What we just in this 2-year period, the Artemis, the dart that hit the asteroid that was 350 feet in diameter, 7 million miles away, hit it bullseye. The fact of the climate predictions, the climate instruments that are giving precision on so many things. Those instruments, for example, if they're operated by NOAA, they were designed, built, and launched by NASA. The rover on Mars and the preparation that it is now digging core samples of that dry lake bed at the place of the mouth of where that river came into that lake. And they're digging those core samples, putting them into titanium tubes about that size. 10 of them already on the surface of Mars, 10 of them in the rover. Another 20 will be put in the rover Perseverance. And then when we send the lander back to pick them up, if the rover is pooped out, the backup is, and of course you've known Ingenuity, the helicopter flying in a 1% atmosphere on Mars. It's flying. It not only flew, it's flown 50 times. It's become a scout for the rover. So on the lander that comes, they're going to put 2 helicopters. So if Perseverance doesn't have the energy to get over to the lander to deposit its 30 tubes, it's got 10 tubes on the surface, and the helicopters will go over and pick them up and bring them back and deposit them in the lander, which then will be returned to Earth. And so this is the kind of gee whiz stuff that we are privileged to do. I'll say one more thing, Mr. Chairman. I mentioned that we go back to the moon in a different way now than we did a half century ago. Half century ago, we went as the U.S. government. This time we go in a public-private partnership with our commercial partners, and we go back with our international partners. The first crew has an astronaut from Canada. I was just there the last couple of days. You can't imagine the enthusiasm of the Canadians and the goodwill that we see not only there, but around the world with our participants. We have 15 a total of us international partners on the International Space Station, and that's just one example. So, Mr. Chairman, if I may, let me just stop right there and entertain your comments and your questions.
Absolutely, Administrator, and a wonderful presentation, and the committee is very appreciative of the kindness. You've sat on our side of the table for many years on both sides of the building, so you know we are by our nature obligated to ask lots of questions.
Of course.
To protect the taxpayers' resources, to make sure that things are accomplished in the spirit of the authorizations. And I have to note, of course, as we've touched on here in many ways, one of the committee's highest priorities is the success of Artemis. And I know I speak for my colleagues when we too share the excitement about the successful completion of Artemis 1 mission late last year. However, much work remains to be done before we see our astronauts return to the moon surface, including development and successfully testing many of the new technologies, such as the spacesuits, the human landing system. NASA currently projects that Artemis 2 will launch in November of 24. Artemis 3 will launch in 2025. How confident are you, Mr. Administrator, on those dates? And what would potentially cause the agency to reevaluate those dates?
A budgetary decision was made about 10, 12 years ago to save money by taking the avionics out of Artemis 1 and putting them over into Artemis 2, instead of having concurrently a second set of avionics built for Artemis II. That is the driver of the 2 years between Artemis I and Artemis II. And so I keep asking the questions, and they tell me that it will be the end of 2024 that we will launch the first crew to the moon in over a half century. It is thought to be that we can have Artemis III, which is the first landing, ready about a year after that. Now, the big driver there is we know we've got Orion, the capsule, and the rocket because we've already tested that. But we're going into lunar polar elliptical orbit, and we're going to rendezvous with a SpaceX lander. And the SpaceX lander is a developing program of which, in the state to the south of yours, Mr. Chairman,
We call it the Republic of Texas, yes.
and it blew a hole in that launch pad. So I have asked, so I could report to you, as of today, that SpaceX is still saying that they think it will take about at least 2 months to rebuild the launch pad, and concurrently about 2 months to have their second vehicle ready to launch. Now understand that the explosion, that's not a big downer in the way that SpaceX does things. They are hardware rich, meaning they've got a lot of those rockets ready to go. And that's their modus operandi. They launch, if something goes wrong, they figure out what it is, they go back and they launch it again. So I anticipate that we will see a number of launches from Boca Chica, Texas, and then they're going to bring that rocket to Bill Posey's in my home county and launch it there after they have already proven and had the experience. So I'm fairly confident, but there are a lot of things that still have to be done.
I'm also concerned about the proposed budget's decision to delay the launch of Artemis IV until September of 2028, as laid out in the budget. Could you explain how NASA reached that decision that the delay was necessary?
Yes, sir. Artemis IV is a different vehicle. It is a larger vehicle. In that law that I just gave the committee a copy of from 2010, it provides for the building of this new rocket and that rocket to be evolvable. In other words, larger. And that's what Artemis IV is going to be, because the SLS, or the rocket, the Space Launch System, has got to be bigger because it's now carrying 2 big payloads. Not only the capsule, Orion, but it's carrying the first component of a lunar space station, a mini space station called Gateway. So the rocket has got to be bigger, it's got to be taller, and it's got to have a bigger mobile launch platform that rolls it out. But the upper stage, built by the European Space Agency, did not have enough funding for this round, and it got delayed, and other kinds of delays in that upper stage that caused it to be kicked into 1 additional year. Now, some additional funding could help remedy part of that, but that's part of the problem.
My time has expired, and before I recognize the gentlelady, I would note, sounds, Mr. Administrator, like not only do you need to work the committee hard, but you're going to spend some quality time with the appropriators and OMB too, sounds like.
As a matter of fact, I already have, Mr.
Thank you.
Chairman.
With that, I yield back and recognize the ranking member for her questions.
Well, thank you, Administrator Nelson. As you described the vision of where we're going, it's truly inspiring. It reminds me as a child getting up at the crack of dawn to see the space shots and being inspired in that way, and a whole generation of young people is going to be inspired again by what you are doing. I do want to get from you the impact of the bill that we passed yesterday. Now, it's only one house. Doesn't mean that it's going to go into effect, but the across-the-board reductions among civilian agencies, according to our appropriators, would result in about a 22% reduction that would essentially be locked in for the next decade. So I'm wondering, if that were to become the final word, what would these funding levels mean for the United States leadership in space, and specifically our competition with China?
It would be disaster. We'd be delayed. You can't take nearly a quarter of your budget away and suddenly get to where you're getting, especially if we're in a space race with China, which we are. China is very clear. They've declared their intention, and when they declare their intention, they usually carry it out, as we've seen in the past. And they've said they're going to the moon with their taikonauts, their astronauts. And so that wouldn't be good. But let me tell you something else that wouldn't be good. If you all can't, and when I say you all, I'm talking about both the House and the Senate, if you can't get to agreement and you go into a continuing resolution, and that makes it go back to the 23 spending or appropriations level, that's not going to be good either. And you're going to have the same kind of outcome, less so than a 22% cut.
What would the impact be on, the chairman has very rightly explored the Artemis program and the delays, but what would that kind of reduction, first the 22% reduction and then the CR level of reduction, what impact would that have on Artemis specifically?
Well, you would have, for example, I've been trying to wrangle some additional funds somewhere so that we could get Artemis 4, instead of 28, get it into 27. Now, that's the one that has the bigger payload and therefore the heavier, more powerful rocket. But Artemis 5, which could be the second lander, and let me explain that. We don't want all of our eggs in one basket. There was a competition. NASA had only so much money. This is pre-me. The decision was made to award it to the best bidder, which was SpaceX, who had underbid everybody else by half. But we don't want to leave all of our eggs in the one basket of a SpaceX lander. We want to have another lander. So we have started the competition. That competition will be determined this summer. We'll know who the winner of that competition is, and they will have another lander. I'd like to get that lander where that on Artemis 5 could land in 28, but the reality is, without any additional funding, you're looking 29, 30, 31. And that's not good, I can tell you, if we're in a space race.
We would fall behind in that case, do you think, our competitors?
With a 22% cut, my goodness, yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Administrator Nelson. You know, I must say, when I saw that rocket blow up, I thought, thank God there's no people on board. Sometimes the lowest bidder is not always the best choice. But with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Posey, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When I saw that thing explode, I was happy it wasn't at KSC. Mr. Administrator, I really am happy with the way you are leading NASA. And to the best of your knowledge, would like to know how you feel NASA's budget for space activities compares with China's, particularly when it comes to lunar operations.
Thank you, Congressman Posey. And you and I feel pretty strongly about this the same way. China has overall dollars in their space program, and their space program is basically a military space program as well, but the human part. They're less dollars compared to ours, but the Chinese government's budget has super opportunity of growing because they are a much, their GNP has so much opportunity for growth, and therefore their space budget to increase within their overall government budget. They have had extraordinary successes in the last decade. And, by the way, a number of their spacecraft, interestingly, look a lot like what you see in the free world spacecraft. So I think we have to be mindful of that.
Well, yeah, it's an undeniable fact that through economic dominance, which they're clearly leading right now, they hope to achieve military superiority, and we can't let that happen. Their first mission to the moon won't be about studying rocks, you know, and the heritage of the Earth, and they militarize everything that they do. Everything that they do, they are a real threat, and I thank you for that good analysis.
May I show you a picture, Congressman?
You may. Show me all the pictures you want, Mr.
This is a picture of the crater-pocked south pole of the moon. This is where we're going, and this is where China's going. Why? Because if this is the moon and the sun is coming in at an angle, there are constantly shadowed parts, as you can see in that picture. In those constant dark parts of the moon, we know is water ice. So we are sending a probe later this year to dig to see if there's water underneath the surface. If there is, you got hydrogen and oxygen. And that's why we want to go to the South Pole. Now, that picture also tells you, with so many craters, it's a dangerous place to land. We got to be right on the money. And there's precious few parts where you can land. And my concern is, as I have stated publicly many times, if China were to get there first, they say, this is our territory, you stay out. And of course, we go as an international mission, and that is for scientific research purposes, peaceful purposes.
You mentioned the DART mission. Do we know yet if it was able to deflect the orbit of the asteroid? They said it would take a while before we'd find out, and I've been watching the news for it. So.
You're talking about the DART mission where we hit the asteroid?
Yeah.
Oh, yes, sir. We knew that fairly quickly afterwards with telescopes that it saw, and the reason we knew so quickly, it was that 350-foot wide asteroid that revolved around an asteroid that was about a half-mile wide. So we could determine that it moved in its orbit around the bigger asteroid by going closer to the asteroid. And that impact at 16,000 miles an hour by that spacecraft that is probably from here to the end of the table wide, it did its job.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time's expired.
The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Oregon, Mrs. Bonamici, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Administrator Nelson. Very nice to see you. Welcome back. Thank you for your leadership. I'm going to focus on the Science Mission Directorate, particularly Earth Science, but also want to talk a bit about workforce and education issues. The recent report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change made clear once again that we must take bold action to address the climate crisis. And I know NASA's Earth Science programs have a strong record of equipping scientists, policymakers, and first responders with critical data to make climate-smart decisions. So I'm going to talk about that, but I also want to mention on the education workforce piece, it's really critical that our future scientists who are helping to develop solutions, that they reflect the diversity of our country. I'm grateful that this budget proposes to increase funding for the Office of STEM Engagement. I'm excited about the Next Gen STEM program, for example. But I want to align myself with the comments of Ranking Member Lofgren about the concerns, deep concerns about the harm that will be caused if the bill that passed the House yesterday goes forward. Really concerned about whether NASA will be able to fulfill its mission. So, Mr. Administrator, in my home state of Oregon, wildfires have increased in frequency and severity. Last year, Oregon State University released a study confirming that climate change played a role in increasing the likelihood of severe wildfires in Oregon and Northern California by about 40% increase. So I'm encouraged that your proposed budget supports the development of Landsat Next system, working with USGS, which will collect, it's my understanding, about 20 times more data than its predecessors, provide new imaging that's going to help emergency responders protect communities from increasingly bad wildfires. So your satellites are really important. I want to emphasize that. So the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology affirmed that the risk of catastrophic wildfires is growing at alarming rates. It's not just in the Pacific Northwest, with disproportionate effects on low-income, rural communities and communities of color. So how will Landsat Next improve our preparedness and response to these wildfires?
Enormously. But Landsat is not the only one, and the future Landsats are not the only one. We have a lot of assets up there, in other words, satellites, that can give incredible detail now to help firefighters and to prevent fires. So, for example, we can tell from orbit if a forest is diseased and therefore more subject to wildfire. Same thing with regard to the moisture content of the soil. Now, that not only applies to forest, but think what that can do for the farmer. We can tell the farmer that this cornfield has such and such moisture content. And so they can plan accordingly on what they're going to plant and how much they have to water. These are tools that we have on orbit. But as you go on down in the development of new technologies, as was the last Landsat that launched a few months ago, right, more capable than the previous, it'll get even greater. As a matter of fact, if I may, we're putting up 4 great observatories in the next decade, and along with existing satellites and those 4, we're going to be able to tell the population of planet Earth, and we're going to share this information with everybody.
Yeah, Administrator, I want to get in another question. I very much appreciate, I want to emphasize that I think oftentimes people think of the work of NASA as in space, but what you do for the planet Earth is really critical as well.
We are a climate agency as well.
So you're proposing it's about a 5.7 increase in the Minority University Research Education Program to increase engagement with community colleges. I'm a graduate of community college myself, and I appreciate the opportunities that they provide. So how does NASA currently engage with community colleges? How will this investment improve these programs?
We engage all the time, and we engage not only through the STEM program, but the grant programs that we have. And just to make sure any of you from rural congressional districts, we've got a specific program that looks to the areas that otherwise might be overlooked from the big science research universities to get it into the rural colleges, universities. So we are trying to do that.
I appreciate it. My time has expired, but even in K-12 system, I know you're working there. So thank you for your leadership. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, may I correct a misstatement that I made earlier? I was talking about the big new rocket, the heavier one, and I said the European Space Agency. They have the European service module that is attached to the Orion vehicle. The upper stage that has to be larger, more powerful, that is behind schedule, and that has been made by Boeing, and there is a delay there in its production.
Duly noted for the record, Mr.
Thank you, sir.
Administrator. And with that, I turn to the gentleman from the Republic of Texas, Mr. Weber, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Administrator, thank you for being here. We're glad you're here. I know I'm not alone in this, but we always want to ensure that NASA has a capability in LEO, low Earth orbit. And recent anomalies about the Russian segment have caused concern about the safety of their crew. Last December, for example, Soyuz, vehicle attached to ISS, began leaking coolant, causing the crew to stay longer. Anticipated problems in repair, and of course, you've already noted the Chinese are intent on getting up there to the moon before we. We would like to see commercial companies incentivized to get the capability up there the soonest. You see where I'm going here? So we can beat the Russians, I guess is a better word, and I mean the Chinese. So how do we do that? Your opinion, your thoughts, please, sir.
Congressman, are you talking about going to the moon, or are you talking about, you said low Earth
Actually,
orbit?
low Earth orbit and beating the moon, because the things that are happening right now don't bode well for low Earth orbit, for example.
Well, if the question is specifically the Chinese, now if you want to discuss the Russians, I'm happy to do that.
Well, I want to discuss both as that they apply to low Earth orbit. We have to be preeminent. We need commercial companies to be able to take that lead with the best technology and competition to do that. How does NASA foster that?
Okay, for Leo. First of all, one of the great ironies is that we can be at such odds with the Russian government and President Putin over the inexcusable things that are going on in Ukraine and have a cooperative space program with the Russians, just like we've had since 1975, when in the Soviet Union, the middle of the Cold War, an American spacecraft rendezvoused and docked with a Soviet spacecraft, and the crews lived together. And ever since, we've had that cooperation in the civilian space program with the Russians. They had the first station. It was Mir. They asked us to come, and the space shuttle docked with Mir. We then built the International Space Station, which is long as a football field, from goalpost to goalpost. We built it together, and we have to operate it together. And that goes on today without a hitch. And that's the irony I'm talking about. However, it's a totally different story with the Chinese in low Earth orbit. They have not cooperated at all. They have their own space station. That's part of the progress they've made in the last 10 years. And they are good, but they are very secretive and non-transparent. So when they've got one of their big rockets that put up a component of the station is tumbling back to Earth, they won't even give coordinates of where they think it's going to be. That's the problem with the Chinese government.
But extrapolate that to how we can be assured that commercialization, that commercial companies can be involved at that level to make sure that we maintain priority, superiority, call it whatever you want, in LEO. How do we do that in spite of the Chinese, and or the Russians could turn on us at any given moment. How do we plan for that?
Okay, and that is a decision that emanates from that law that I just gave you a copy of, because we are going to get out of the business of an international space station. We're going to deorbit it. It's aging. We're going to deorbit it in 2030, 31. And we are going to turn it over to commercial. And so we are now giving contracts to several commercial companies to create commercial space stations. Indeed, one of those commercial companies is going to attach their commercial first module to the International Space Station as a precursor to them then using it as the core to start their own commercial, larger space station. That is underway right now.
So I think we can all agree that it is a very noble goal for us to make sure that our commercial companies stay first and foremost in supporting this effort and getting it done.
We're spending quite a bit of money giving them the financial incentive to do just that.
Glad to hear that. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. Stevens, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you so much, and it's so wonderful to see you again, Mr. Administrator. Thanks for your great testimony and your presentation and phenomenal leadership of NASA. I had a couple of questions for you. I represent southeastern Michigan, and it's home to a robust supply chain of primarily automotive suppliers who have diversified into the defense and aerospace sector. Companies like Futurama are a great example of this, as well as Detroit Flex, who for years was doing the tubes that went into the auto engine and are now doing the tubes that go into the space engine. And we know that the NASA collaborations with the private sector, and particularly the suppliers, have brought out some of the best in commercial industry to accelerate development, improve safety, and frankly, save us some money. So these partnerships are creating lasting, strong, good jobs that, pay a high wage. I see it in my district. Obviously, we know what is happening across the country. Could you just speak to why this approach has been so successful?
First of all, walk into any classroom in America and start talking about space, particularly if you're wearing a blue suit, a blue jumpsuit, walking into a classroom, and just see what the fascination of this generation that's coming on. And I mentioned the fascination of our international partners. There's this genuine desire in all of us to want to be explorers, adventurers. You take that subject matter and marry it up with the intent of your question, with the corporate community, with the commercial partners, and then you have the ability to tap the genius of America and share the expenses so that NASA's not paying the whole freight in order to get the best product at the cheapest price, with NASA complete oversight because of the necessity of safety.
Yeah, and the last time I checked, the federal government isn't a manufacturer, right? And so in some respects, the partnerships and the way in which you can work with suppliers gets the best results. And also, right, it does compel a mission for these companies, and I saw it at Detroit Flex, headquartered in Troy. I saw the smile on these guys' faces. They had the same thing you're talking about. the picture of outer space. It totally transformed their company. And speaking of transformative figures, sir, we are delighted to hear about Artemis II in Michigan, because the pride and joy of Grand Rapids, Miss Christina Koch, is going to be going on that lunar moon landing trip. Are we still targeted for November 2024? What else do we need to know about Artemis II?
Well, first of all,
And the first woman who's going to go to the moon.
that's correct. And when we land, by the way, on Artemis 3, 2 of the 4 will go down to the surface, and it will be the first woman and the next man that will walk on the surface of the moon in a half a century. Look at the crew. The commander, an F-18 test pilot. The pilot, African-American F-18 test pilot. Christina Cook, the only engineer on the crew. The fourth is our partner, Canada, a Canadian Royal Air Force F-18 test pilot. And the 4 of them are a smattering of North America. They are representative of North America. And this is just the first crew. So we're going to see...
We're going to see the best of America going into outer space, which is great,
seeing
in
it.
November 2024. And thank you for the leadership. And might we just reflect that a lot has happened in 50 years to be able to send Christina on that mission. Thank you, sir, and I yield back.
Artemis II will orbit the moon, right, Director?
Artemis II will orbit the moon, check out all the life support systems, the spacecraft. Then Artemis 3 goes into lunar orbit, and the crew transfers into the SpaceX lander.
Thank you, Director. With that, I yield to the gentleman from Indiana, Dr. Baird, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, and thank you, Mr. Administrator, for being here. I can remember the first time we went to the moon, and that was quite an experience, and very, very important in our community. Anyway, I'm involved in agriculture, as many of you know, and so you mentioned agriculture and knowing what the soil moisture was, and so I guess I would just ask you what other areas give you an opportunity to explain how what we're doing in NASA can be a benefit to agriculture, because we got to feed 9 billion people by 1950 or so, or by 2050. So, any thoughts in that regard?
Yes, sir. Congressman, where's your district?
West Central Indiana, corn,
Okay.
soybean, cattle, and hog.
All right. So I went to Kansas for Senator Jerry Moran. We went out into one of his farmers' fields. And we can literally tell from space where he's going to have a drought problem because of the moisture content of the soil. We can tell him if he's going to have, and this is not secret information, this is available. We can tell him if he's got disease in his crops. I mentioned with regard to forest fires, same thing. We have the ability in the middle of the desert to tell if there is deposits of water and where you ought to drill for water in the desert. That is what is incredible. And as we ran out of time with a question over here, we're going to have such a 3D composite of everything that's happening to the earth so that you're going to know in the next decade exactly what is happening to the water, the land, the ice, and the atmosphere. And it will be available to everyone, and it'll be available virtually as well.
That's really amazing, and it'll be a real asset to agriculture. But as I was listening to you talk, just how good are your cameras? I've been known to go to the woods occasionally on the back end of the farm, and I'd just like to know how good your cameras really are.
Well,
But anyway,
I suspect you ought to ask another agency that question.
you got me to thinking about it, I'll tell you that. You know, the other question I have, I'm really interested in research and the university, and I thought maybe you could tie together the work you do with universities and the significance of the universities and their work as it contributes to NASA. Purdue University is my alma mater, so if you don't mind.
Yes, sir. And by the way, a tribute to Purdue. Next to Annapolis, Purdue produces the most astronauts. Universities are critical because we're a science research organization. And so where do we get that science? We get it from industry. We get it from universities, colleges, technical schools. We get that information often in the incentive of a NASA contract with financial incentives for that university, corporation, and so forth to do it. Yes, sir.
So that really ends up being a two-way street, doesn't it? I mean, what you find out at NASA and space contributes to what the universities can do. So anyway, I appreciate that, and I appreciate you being here today. Thank you.
Thank you.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Sorensen, for 5 minutes.
Hello there, everyone. I'd like to thank Chairman Lucas and Ranking Member Lofgren for convening this hearing and Administrator Nelson for appearing before us today. I'm proud to serve as the ranking member on the committee's subcommittee on space and aeronautics, and I'm the proud son of an aerospace engineer. Now, the work that NASA does is tremendously important for humanity, for implications far beyond what we can scientifically think of today. I often say that without the technology to put the human on the moon, we wouldn't have these in our hands today. Now we're going back to the moon to find where that water ice is, to learn more. I'm excited for this new age of space exploration, as are the folks in my district in northwestern Illinois. Scientists across the country, we're making these impacts since the 1960s. Now, Artemis 3 will send humans to new and exciting places on the moon, including polar caps, where we will hopefully find that ice. What new research do you anticipate the scientific community will undertake with these samples as we bring them back from the moon in 2025?
Before I answer that, Congressman, I want to say, aren't you a former weatherman?
I am a meteorologist by trade, correct.
It is true that NASA is a climate agency as well as a space and aviation aeronautics agency.
I would not have been able to do my job for 22 years without the investment in science that NASA has provided.
Well, you're the best walking advertisement for what NASA does. Right there. And when you held up your cell phone, in that cell phone is an amazing camera. And that is a camera on a chip. And that was developed by NASA in our Earth observations. So thank you. And I got so excited about saying that, I forgot your question.
What do you expect to get from our
samples
our
from Mars? Okay. So the likelihood, if there was life, was where that lake was. And what better place than the mouth of the river where the river spilled into the lake. And so we are drilling in different places with the rover Perseverance. And by bringing back these titanium-filled tubes of samples of those cores in different locations that the scientists at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory have decided are the likelihood, then we ought to be able to determine, was there life there? Is there still life there? What kind of life was there? in just a small sampling of the surface of Mars before we send humans there in about 2040 in order to explore further. And that's the purpose of these samples.
I'm glad you mentioned 2040 because just a couple of weeks ago, it was probably the greatest part about being a congressman so far in my short tenure. I was able to bring Dr. Kate Rubins, NASA astronaut, to a first grader, to first grade elementary school in my district. Having the understanding that it is my job as a congressman to make sure that these kids can grow up and be whomever they want to be when they grow up. And then Dr. Rubins was able to inspire them, understanding that the kids that we were talking to may be about the same age as the first person to stand on Mars. How do we continue to inspire them?
Well, you said it already. You saw what happened to the faces of those kids when astronaut Dr. Rubins walked in to the classroom. They're fascinated with space, as are most people, but especially this next generation, because they've grown up with technologies that we never grew up with when I was growing up. And so this is just normal fare for them. And they have some distant memory that we are out there in space going to the moon, but they almost nightly can see it, that something's happening out in space today. And so this is what the Artemis generation, it was the Apollo generation, and from that became an educational revolution of scientists and engineers and technicians and mathematicians. And you can imagine what is going to come out of the Artemis generation as a result of us going back to the moon and then going to Mars and further.
Everything we do is for them. My time has expired. I yield, but thank you so much. It's an honor.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Williams, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator, Administrator, I have a serious matter to bring before you. My mother-in-law was a home economics teacher at Melbourne High School in 1960 and 61, and I can bet you didn't see this question coming. But your reputation even then actually was one of a stellar leader, and she has recounted that many times to me over the years. But interesting connection there. But I'd like to, if I may, draw your attention, sir, to a piece of legislation that Representative Sorensen and I introduced just this morning, which is to bring the DOE and NASA together in an interagency research act, and that allow the agencies to collaborate research that is obvious of mutual interest and hopefully streamline and advance and accelerate your goals and the goals of the DOE. Can you speak about the partnership between DOE and NASA and how their partnership may help advance science and your mission at NASA, sir?
Congressman, and it's not only the Department of Energy, it's other agencies as well, because what it is in particular is we know if we're going to be on the moon and spend any appreciable time, we're going to have to produce electricity on the moon. And the nuclear production of electricity, you can't, at the South Pole, with limited, as I showed that example of this is the moon and this is the sun and the sun's rays are coming in here, it's constant on the equator of the moon, but not at the South Pole, because you've got the sun coming in at angles. So you're going to have a power source of electricity other than sunlight there. So too in missions going all the way to Mars. And therefore, in going to Mars, you need to get to Mars faster than we go with hydrogen and oxygen, conventional chemical propulsion. We got to get there faster. Otherwise, it's such a long mission that you have to stay on the surface until the planets realign in order to get back. So we are doing nuclear thermal research for propulsion and nuclear electric propulsion. Now, some of that is with the Department of Energy, but some of that is with other agencies as well.
If your staff would inform us about that, you're exceptionally well informed, and you may know that I'm the first nuclear submarine officer to serve in Congress in 50 years. I've often thought of service on submarines was good preparation for being in space. The trade-offs are the view's a lot better in space, but the food's a lot better on a submarine. So, you know, you got to pick your poison. You've mentioned this many times about the space race with China and in general about public-private sector partnership in your administration. You know, as NASA collaborates with private industry, as well as international partners, what advantage, how can you quantify or give color to the advantage that that partnership provides in the context of the space race with China? Why is that an advantage? What would you point to, sir?
You're talking about the international partnership?
Well, I'm talking specifically about public-private, specifically working with private industry.
Yes, sir.
And international maybe second, but.
Well, that's the difference. We go back to the moon this time with international partners as well as corporate partners. And why not tap the genius of American ingenuity in its enterprise? That's the whole theory. Great example is the commercial crew and commercial cargo to the International Space Station. That came out of that law that I just gave you a copy of that went to the moon and back. And what it provides for is that NASA forms these partnerships. This particular one, example, SpaceX, created their own rocket, created their own spacecraft, Dragon, with substantial NASA help and financial incentive, and look at the success. The Falcon 9 has become the workhorse of the United States commercially and government getting to space. And look what it did for commercial cargo and crew. So NASA contracts with SpaceX to send our cargo and crew. Now, when it's a NASA mission, we're all over it to make sure that the astronauts are safe. But look at the phenomenal record that SpaceX has had. We want that same kind of record for SpaceX on the lander on the moon, but the other winner of the other competition for the second lander as well. And so, I mean, the proof's in the pudding, Congressman.
Thank you, sir. My time's expired. Thank you. There's a Submariner in the space station right now, and please hire more Submariners for space.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentle lady from Oregon, Miss Salinas, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you and the ranking member for this really quite inspirational hearing today. Administrator Nelson, I hear all the time from folks back home and business leaders that they need more skilled technical workers, and in many cases, these folks wouldn't necessarily need advanced or even four-year degrees, but they do need a solid K-12 STEAM foundation and opportunities for career and technical training. And my district is home to a number of advanced manufacturers that produce components for some of NASA's most ambitious programs. A company called Machine Sciences Corporation, for example, just contributed sensor chassis to a SpaceX Dragon spacecraft that recently returned from the International Space Station. I'm worried, though, that we're not doing enough to prepare our youth to participate in this exciting advanced manufacturing and innovation economy that Congress has really been quite focused on the last couple of years. And I'm particularly concerned that we're not taking full advantage of some of the public-private partnerships between our major research university and industry partners, but also bringing in existing resources like our community and technical colleges, which already have a presence in some of our rural communities. So my question is, can you tell me more about how NASA fosters those partnerships between academia and industry, particularly our community and technical colleges, to support STEM and STEAM education and grow that skilled and technical workforce pipeline?
A good example would be NASA has about 17,000 civil servants, but NASA has about 47,000 contractors. And they all wear the NASA badge. Now, those contractors have to have suppliers. And many times, just exactly what you said already, an eloquent presentation, you don't have to have the college degree. But if you've had training at a community college or a technical college, technicians, as part of the supply chain of everything that goes in to the rocket, the spacecraft, the preparations, all the things to keep humans alive in space, or our machines alive in space that do such wondrous things for us. It's all a part. And so you need flexibility. You need that ability to tap whatever it is that supplies it. And therefore, it gets you to the STEM education. You want to inspire these kids at early ages to get interested in these fields so that we have an abundant supply of people, whatever their chosen occupation is, to feed the space program everything that it needs.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman, Mr. Miller, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, and thank you to Administrator Nelson for joining this afternoon. And I just want to say one thing and then I'll digress. To be clear, it's nobody's intention to cut the funding for NASA. But this is what happens when we as a full body of the House can't come together for the betterment of our country and every single American within inside of it. But thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member, again. Administrator Nelson, as you may know, I have the privilege of representing the NASA Glenn Research Center in Ohio's 7th Congressional District. I visited the facility just a few short weeks ago, and I'm grateful to the Center Director, Dr. Jimmy Kenyon, and the rest of the facility staff for pulling together such an informative visit. It really was amazing. I enjoyed the opportunity to tour the facility, learn more about Glenn's cutting-edge work, and to see for myself some of the projects that we've discussed right here at this committee, including Glenn's research on fission surface power. As part of my visit, we also held a roundtable with NASA officials. Local elected officials and other members of the local aerospace industry, where we discussed a strong desire to grow NASA Glenn's footprint in Ohio. You may be aware that while total NASA spending is up 60% in recent years, Glenn's budget has grown closer to 10 to 20%, which some have interpreted as a reflection of Glenn's status in NASA's constellation of facilities. Administrator Nelson, can you explain the importance of NASA Glenn and Ohio to NASA and its mission, and provide reassurance to Glenn's workforce and the surrounding communities that rely on Glenn's presence, that Glenn continues to be and will continue to be an integral part of NASA's mission moving forward?
Not only in our space research does Glenn do just incredible things, a lot of which we've already discussed here. For example, you said the nuclear production of electricity, but also nuclear propulsion that we've already discussed here. But also, Glenn has a major component in our aeronautics research and is involved in its wind tunnels, in other experimentation on producing, for example, what we're going to fly at the end of this year, the needle-nosed, radical design, future transport to go supersonic, but create a low sonic boom so that it can go supersonic over populated areas that otherwise you can't, because the boom is just too jarring for the population. Or for what will be, for example, we got a program going with Boeing right now on what will ultimately be the replacement for the Boeing 737, the workhorse of commercial aviation for medium haul, single aisle passenger aircraft. This one's going to have a 25% greater efficiency and therefore 25% less fuel by the design of the wing and the design of the engines. That is going on at Glenn right now.
It is, and during my visit we went over that, and it's absolutely fascinating and exciting to see. Given Glenn's expertise in a number of fields, including propulsion and communications, I'd love to see the facility designated as a program lead in electrical aircraft propulsion, the Communication Services Program, and more. Can you walk us through NASA Glenn's plans for the future of these programs in NASA Glenn, and maybe even, Administrator, commit to designating them as program leads?
NASA always helps create the research that we happily share with the private sector. This is an area, specifically you asked for electric propulsion. This is an area that the private sector has exceeded our expectations, because the private sector is producing electric-powered aircraft that not only are going to change the way of getting around in the urban setting, but on short-haul aircraft are likely to become electric-powered aircraft. And a lot of that is being done at Glenn.
Well, I appreciate that, Administrator, and just again, maybe just consider, even to commit to designating them as program leads would make us very happy, and a lot of production going on in Northeast Ohio. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from North Carolina, Ms. Fushi, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Administrator Nelson, for appearing before this committee and for your testimony here today. NASA has a significant footprint in my home state of North Carolina, supporting more than 1,100 jobs and generating more than $175 million in state economic output. And through NASA's National Space Grant College and Fellowship Project administered by North Carolina State University, the North Carolina Space Grant Program has been at the forefront of supporting STEM research and facilitating aerospace workforce development and outreach efforts across the state for decades. Additionally, North Carolina Space Grant's long-standing partnership with the North Carolina Community College System attracts community colleges across the state to participate in its North Carolina Community College Research Pathways and High-Altitude Ballooning Challenge programs. In my home district alone, the North Carolina Space Grant Program supports 9 graduate research fellows, a faculty research grant at UNC Chapel Hill, and 2 community college research grant initiatives at Alamance Community College and Durham Tech. And I must say I was thrilled at the recent announcement naming Christina Cook as one of Artemis II mission crew members. Ms. Cook attended high school in my district at the North Carolina School of Math and Science, and notably, the North Carolina Space Grant supplied funding for her NASA internship while she was a student at North Carolina State University. She would then go on to become an astronaut and set a record for the longest single space flight by a woman, with a total of 328 days in space, and also to participate in the first all-woman spacewalks. So I had to get that in there. I am interested in hearing your thoughts on a report issued by the NASA Inspector General last week that found that, and I'm quoting from the report, despite support from agency leaders and multiple initiatives to increase diversity, we found NASA has made little progress in increasing the representation of women and minorities in its civilian workforce or leadership ranks. So my question is, how will NASA work to address the causes identified in the IG's report of the lack of discernible progress to advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion and accessibility at NASA, such as the need to move from a compliance-driven, siloed approach to one integrated across agency functions and embedded into agency culture?
That IG report just came out. We accept all 7 recommendations. Those are being implemented, but they have been implemented starting 2 years ago, because that report gives you their conclusion on the basis of 10 years of data, but that data stopped in the 10 years ending 2021. So as soon as we got in, we take this thing on diversity very seriously, and I welcome that IG report, and I agree. But that isn't something that, since we just got the IG report last week, that we're starting. We've been working on this for the last 2 years.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear that. And Mr. Chairman, I yield the rest of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Strong, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Lucas, and congratulations, Administrator Nelson, on the successful flight of Artemis 1. I had the pleasure of watching the splashdown at Toyota Field in Huntsville, Alabama, with many of the engineers from Marshall Space Flight Center and our contractors that are so able in what they do. The success of this mission would not be possible without the 7,000 employees in my district who work at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, who continue to work in the refinement of the Space Launch System is vital to the success of the upcoming Artemis II crew flight. NASA's work ensures that the U.S. remains a beacon of science, discovery, and exploration. Administrator Nelson, as you have mentioned, NASA collaborates with a variety of research centers and government agencies. The Marshall Space Flight Center works closely with DARPA on nuclear thermal rocket engines, which make it possible to power a spacecraft to the Moon, Mars, and beyond. Administrator, I'm glad you mentioned nuclear thermal research. The FY24 President's budget allocates $15.8 million for nuclear thermal propulsion research. NTP research, development, and testing are just the fundamental of space flight. Do you feel that the $15.8 million adequately reflects the importance of this research?
I remind you that the President proposes and the Congress disposes.
Get it.
And you have consistently, as the Congress, in your wisdom, determined for nuclear thermal, $110 million each appropriation cycle for nuclear thermal. What I want to urge you to do is don't leave out nuclear electric propulsion, because that's even a faster way of getting to Mars. But there are uses for each. And so I thank you for bringing that to the attention of the committee.
Thank you. If this turns out that this research is unfunded, should we expect further delays in rocket propulsion test programs?
Are you talking about nuclear thermal or nuclear electric?
No, not electric propulsion.
Nuclear thermal?
Yes.
As a matter of fact, I think we have just announced a program called Draco that will be partially funded by us and by DARPA on nuclear thermal propulsion. And I'll have to get you the details of that project, but I'm pretty sure that's already underway.
Thank you. There's more to Artemis than just a rocket or a capsule. NASA needs much more: landers, surface habits, power. The list goes long, and the activity takes time to develop. At the same time, NASA's budget is not immune from inflation, and as previously mentioned, has already experienced delays in schedule for the future of Artemis missions. What is NASA doing to ensure the right programs and offices are being established now at the center with the expertise to guide these efforts so that NASA can successfully execute its exploration goals.
For the first time in a long time, we have set up a program office for the Moon to Mars initiative. And that has, I've already named the head as the program manager. That operates under the Exploration Mission Directorate, which is headed by Jim Free. And so that is underway.
Thank you, Mr. Nelson. Mr. Chairman Lucas, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Jackson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, sir. In a moment, I'm going to ask you about Europa because it's a mission I'm really excited about. I don't think enough Americans know about it, and I want to give you the opportunity to tell people about why it's such an exciting mission. Before I do, I just want to make a couple observations. I think one of the themes that we're hearing today is spend less but go faster. And I think you're probably familiar with those twin requests, and I know that it's a difficult balance. But it does feel like there's just broad enthusiasm for your mission and for recent accomplishments and for things that are just beyond the horizon. I also want to thank your administration for being very intentional about reaching out to members of this committee. I'm a new member, and your administration has really been intentional about sitting down with me and educating me about some of the missions that are coming up. Dr. Jessica Watkins came to my office, and I just asked her every question under the sun, including what is the first step of becoming an astronaut. And she told me that it's you go online and apply at usajobs.gov, which I couldn't believe. I asked her to send me the link, and we're going to keep the dream alive. I also wasn't aware of the footprint in my district for manufacturing. I was just under the assumption that NASA didn't have anything to do with my district, and I represent Charlotte, North Carolina. And they showed me the map that showed me a lot of manufacturing partners there in the district, which is something that I talk to my constituents now in town hall, something that we can be proud of that we didn't even know about. And now, with those general observations, Europa, why is this such a special mission?
It is in law that NASA has a mission to determine if there is life out in the universe. Things like the James Webb Space Telescope are helping us understand more and more about how big this universe is. But here in our own solar system, we're going to Mars. We're digging right now those titanium-filled tubes. We're going to bring them back. We're going to see, was there life there? We want to go to other parts of the universe, of the solar system, where we have a chance of getting to within a reasonable amount of time. And Europa is a moon of one of the planets that it's very cold on the outside, but underneath, because of the heat of the core of the moon, there is a sea. And if there's a sea of water, is there life there? And so we want to find that out. We're doing the same thing over on another planet. We're going to go there. It's got a thick cloud. This is, which one is this? That's hotter. Venus. We're going to Venus. It has a shroud, a cloud that is a cloud cover that is so thick. We're going to first characterize that cloud cover, and then later with another mission, we're going to go down through that cloud cover, down and see what's underneath, and see if there's any life there. And so we have these kind of probes going out, and Europa is thought, if there's life out there, it may well be in that sea of Europa.
And from what I understand, the remarkable part of this mission is it doesn't even require landing on Europa. We're going to send a probe through a spray into space of liquid vapor to intercept the liquid vapor on pass. Am I right about that?
Yes, and this, by the way, is a mission that's going pretty soon. It's going next year, 2024.
That's
going
fantastic.
to They call it the Europa Clipper.
It's fantastic. And I'll just leave you with one more general observation. I have a theory that every time you see a bunch of NASA employees cheering, it means that something undeniably good has happened. And I struggle to come up with another group of people for whom that is true. Knowing nothing else other than a certain group of people is cheering that something good for the world has occurred. It's really hard to think of another group for which that's true. Thank you.
Congressman, around the space program, interestingly, people can unite. It's a unifying factor, and that indeed, for me, who spent most of my adult life in service to our country, that to me is a very gratifying fact.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Garcia, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Administrator, good to see you, and very proud of your tact in not informing the Army guy that Army guys can't go to space. So that was very, very gentlemanly of you. Thank you for your service, Mr. Jackson, though. Just kidding. I first of all want to thank you for your service and everything you've done. I feel like we've seen each other more probably than our respective families in the last 3 weeks. Thanks again for coming out to the 27th District, California for your NASA Town Hall. We talked about it there briefly, but I want to try to help as much as I can, either from the authorizing or appropriations perspective, on helping Armstrong and Edwards get the better aircraft, the blue and white chase aircraft out there. I know that the team out there has been bending over backwards to try to get the new longerons on the F-15s, keep these things basically through service life extension, fatigue life extension programs. But as we look at all those bills sort of pile up, and then we look long for lineup right on the long-term sustainment side of these aircraft, I keep coming back to if we can just work with the DoD to get NASA at some point to get, not in front of the line privileges, but pretty close. The fact that we have Blue Angels flying with F-18 Super Hornets right now and not classic Hornets tells me that there are jets out there that we should be able to get, two-seat F-18s or two-seat F-15EXs. And I know that NASA, I think in the last bill, has a requirement to report to CJS on the discussions that you're having with DoD to get those chase aircraft. I guess, sir, what is the status of those discussions? And what can we do to help facilitate? Do we need to just get NASA, DoD, and Congress in the same room at the same time and do a wire diagram to find you two aircraft? I'm worried, frankly, that these some of these planes had real risk of the wings falling off of them and landing in civilian populations doing very important missions out there. What can we do to help you, and how are those conversations going thus far?
After I saw you, Congressman, at Edwards, I am told that they have identified the used military aircraft that we need, and that's in the pipeline. So I was encouraged on the two that we need. Now, if I find that there's a hiccup there, I'm going to call you.
Okay.
Because we desperately need three of them. We
Right,
need
that's
one old one for parts that we can scavenge to put on the other two.
And we're coming up on the end of production lines for some of these fourth-gen two-seaters that fit the mission out there. So I'm concerned that the DoD is going to stiff-arm you or keep giving you, the ugly birds instead of the golden birds, and you're going to be left holding a bag of parts and planes that don't need those parts and need other parts in 10 years from now. So maybe we can work with your staff to see which aircraft they're talking about, and then we go beat the drum with DoD partners to make sure that we're keeping that dialogue going, because I do think it's a safety of flight issue, and once we lose those, we don't just lose the chase aircraft, we lose the mission, basically, because the test aircraft can no longer get up there. So if you're okay with it, I'd love to keep this conversation going offline, staff level especially, and find that wire diagram to those aircraft and figure out if that's the right answer or if there's a longer-term solution that we can get newer aircraft for you.
We can also use some G5, so if you got, help us identify those too.
All right, we'll deal with that one as well. But thank you, Mr. Administrator, again for your service. Thank you. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Ohio, Mrs. Hikes.
Thank you so much, Chair and Administrator Nelson. It's been a pleasure to be in your presence today as we're talking about something that has certainly piqued a lot of interest and conversation in the work that you do. So thank you for that. In a couple committees ago, I declared that the road to Mars goes through Ohio, and no one challenged me on that, so I will assume that's true here. And I heard you talk about some of the work that you're planning to do, and we're looking forward to that work, but the challenge with doing that work with a budget put forth from the majority here that would significantly stymie that progress, I know is challenging here. And as we all are communicating how our constituencies and our congressional districts are connected to NASA, I am not going to be excluded from that. I am fortunate to represent Ohio's 13th congressional district, which is the hometown of Judy Resnick. We know that the road to Mars started with Neil Armstrong from Ohio, and obviously you served in the Senate with our good Ohioan John Glenn. But also want to talk to you about some of the our district's connection to the rubber industry and the fact that Goodyear and its workers helped supply the tires for the Apollo missions, and you continue to work with suppliers and manufacturers across Northeast Ohio, particularly in Ohio's 13th. I just want you to elaborate on that, talk about any other partnerships that you know and how they can be and would be inhibited by the Default on America Act that was passed out of chambers yesterday.
I have seen, Congresswoman, some of the prototypes of the wheels of these moon buggies. And then, of course, we get to Mars, they'll be all the more sophisticated. Interestingly, they're not made of rubber. But it's coming from tire companies that are making the presentations. And it's incredible. It's got to be highly durable. It's got to have the right kind of traction so that it doesn't get stuck. In some cases, it's got to be expandable into the proper size. And in some cases, it's made of exquisite materials. All of this is in research, and the tire companies, such as Goodyear, are in fact doing the research for us. It will be one component of a rover. One of the rovers being worked on right now will be a habitable rover, where the astronauts can actually get in, take off their space suits that they would have to have in the vacuum of the moon with no atmosphere. And then they'd be able to live more comfortably as they roamed around the surface. So that is well underway.
Thank you, Administrator. And I want to talk a bit about the workforce and the people who are actually moving this type of technology forward. You mentioned semiconductors in another conversation, and yesterday's discussion, we talked about how this budget we received that was passed out yesterday would inhibit 280,000 semiconductor technicians from our communities in Ohio. It would be one of those places where we would lose quite a bit. And I know that NASA has been facilitating technology transfers with the private sector and the talent exchange programs we've discussed with NASA employees in the industry helps you maintain your edge. Again, keeping in mind and thinking about the budget that was passed forth and losing the semiconductor employees, what does that look like in NASA? And of course, want you to discuss how and if you can commit to working with Congress and labor unions that represent your employees to make sure that we're doing right by them and they have all of the tools that they need in order to work safely and get the funding that they need to live comfortably in Northeast Ohio and beyond.
Thank you so much for bringing this up, because we don't have the statutory authority to do this talent exchange program like the Department of Defense has that. And so we have made a proposal to the Congress, to this committee specifically, in order to have that statutory authority. So may I send our staff to talk to you about this? That would be very helpful if you all are considering a NASA authorization bill.
Thank you, Mr. Administrator. I would very much welcome that conversation, and I very appreciate your time and your expertise. And Mr. Chair, I yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentlelady's time as it yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from the Republic of Texas, Dr. Babin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Administrator, great to see you. Thank you for being here. As usual, very informative, entertaining. We appreciate the good job and service you're doing. Some of this has been asked a little bit, touched around by my friend and colleague from Texas, Mr. Weber. Recent anomalies aboard the Russian segment have caused concern about the safety of the crew. Last December, a Soyuz vehicle attached to the ISS began leaking coolant, causing the crew to stay longer than anticipated in new vehicles to launch to provide transportation. A similar leak occurred on an uncrewed Progress vehicle later on. In 2021, the Nalka module errantly fired its thrusters, causing the ISS to spin 1.5 times until the thrusters finally ran out of fuel. Additionally, Russian segments of the ISS have experienced leaks going back several years. We held a hearing on this topic in 2021. Please take a moment to, very briefly, because I have several other questions, to discuss the state of the International Space Station in partnership with Russia. I know that you've reiterated that the partnership remains strong and has provided an important bridge between our two nations going back to the Cold War years and the Apollo-Soyuz testing project. Are supply chain challenges causing anomalies? Is Roscosmos workforce overworked or distracted, or is this just a funding issue for them?
Mr. Chairman Babin, the Russians have been very good at everything. And with regard to this anomaly that got everybody's attention, we think that they are on top of it. I can't tell you if that's a design issue or if it was a production issue. We pretty well ruled out with the consultation with the Russians that it was a meteorite that had come in.
Okay.
However, that, is still being explored.
Right.
But there has not been a problem of transparency between the two of us. We built the station together. We operate it together. And both the cosmonauts and the astronauts know that we have to continue to work together.
Yes, sir.
For the safety of the crew.
Thank you very much. The U.S. is prohibited from sending money to Russia under the Iran, North Korea, Syria Non-Proliferation Act, or INCSNA. A waiver exists for payments for the ISS, but it expires in 2025. NASA asked for an extension of the waiver in its yearly legislative request package. The ISS was recently extended to 2030 under the CHIPS and Science Act, and the Russians announced their own extension to 2028 just yesterday. Given the current geopolitical climate, please take a moment to explain why it is necessary to once again waive INCSNA for ISS payments now that we provide our own transportation to the ISS under the Commercial Crew Program, and this budget request proposes to deorbit the ISS using U.S. capabilities.
Deorbit the ISS with the Russians. But in the case that something happened to the geopolitics between now and 2030, the funding request of some $200 million in next year, 2024, is in order to start to build that capability if we had to deorbit it safely ourselves.
Yes.
Now, the basic operation of the station is we do it together. We don't send our astronauts just on American vehicles. We integrate the crews for exactly the reason that we always need both nations on the station in case something went wrong with one of the vehicles having access to get us up there, that we'd have the crew up there of both nations to operate the station.
Yes, sir. Okay, thank you. Really quick. I represent Johnson Space Center, home of the Astromaterials Acquisition and Curation Facility, with nearly 50-year history and the expertise to go along with it. Can you commit that the Mars sample curation and storage will be managed by JSC, but not only that, but also located at JSC, because they have decades of experience with not only lunar samples, but with comet samples, meteorite samples, solar wind samples, as well as asteroid samples?
Mr. Chairman, as you know, on that office, that's going to be at Johnson. And what I can commit to is that it will be the program office at Johnson that will decide what will be done with that sample. Okay. I think we better leave it to the experts, and that expertise is residing at Johnson.
Thank you very much. I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
I think the gentleman's accomplished a lot and has yielded back the remainder of his time. With that, the chair turns to the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Lee, 4 or 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So my constituents in Western Pennsylvania don't immediately think of NASA when considering the impact of federal funding on our community. NASA programs are funding, NASA programs and funding are critical to our local economy, technological development, and educational opportunities. Yesterday, I had the privilege of meeting with Deputy Administrator Melroy, and she talked to us about not just her passion for STEM education, for equity and diversity in STEM education, which is a huge initiative in Pittsburgh, which is becoming an innovation hub. Also, what most people don't know, we're also an area that is looking into space exploration. It was a shock to me also, and I've talked about it here before, and we talked about it yesterday. We have a employee-owned robotics and space company called Astrobotics, and they're building one of the rovers that we are hoping will be one of the first from a private company to make it to the moon. And we just talked about how NASA has been able to support that. We talked about the risk, and we talked about how that risk is worth it, and how not only will that have benefits and payout for Astrobotics, but for our entire region and obviously our country. Even without a physical facility in my district, the agency has a strong presence, as I've said, in the region through these partnerships also with our local universities and businesses and organizations, partnerships with Carnegie Mellon University and the University of Pittsburgh that support research and educational programs in robotics, artificial intelligence, space exploration. NASA's Office of STEM Engagement provides grants and scholarships and internships to students pursuing careers in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. These opportunities help to prepare our local students for high-tech careers and provide a pathway to success in growing industries. To inspire the next generation of innovators, we must continue to fully fund agencies like this. Space and science and technology are admittedly not my area of expertise, but how does NASA funding for space research and exploration improve living standards here on Earth? And how do we highlight this to people and communities who have never envisioned themselves as contributors to the work your agency does?
Well, Congresswoman, you just made an eloquent statement about NASA and about your district, that the congressman from North Carolina said he didn't think that any NASA stuff was going on in his district until he checked. And aren't you surprised?
Yes.
And it's in every one of your districts when you actually see how many suppliers there might be. Your question about STEM education is absolutely critical to every congressional district, because it's our future. It's the future of the Artemis generation. Science, technology, engineering, mathematics, the spin-offs from the space technology that are occurring, that you don't think of, the cancer research that's going on board the International Space Station right now. The camera in your pocket, in your cell phone, is a NASA invention of a camera on a chip, and it goes on and on. So I could keep going on and on.
I think you made an excellent point. And I just think it's important that we use these opportunities. You know, we think oftentimes that, you know, space exploration and the work of NASA is otherworldly. It's not something that impacts our day-to-day lives, and we just want to make sure that we're using opportunities to lift up the ways that it impacts us, from GPS to our cameras.
To good jobs.
And exactly, to good jobs. To that end, how is NASA funding being used to create more opportunities to attract, train, and retrain talent from a diverse geographic and socioeconomic backgrounds?
NASA directly puts into the national economy over $75 billion. That equates to about 400,000 jobs directly. But indirectly, just think, what would be the advantages of a community such as yours, the fact that we have GPS of advance warnings on weather that are coming from a lot of the assets that we have up there in space, of the STEM education that the space program excite people in all communities into those fields that provide, not necessarily in space, but the STEM subjects, very robust and good paying jobs, and stable jobs, by the way. So here we are, this little bitty agency called NASA, $27 billion in our budget, compared to the budget of the United States. And look what influence it's had on the economy and the well-being and the quality of life of our people here on the earth.
Gentlelady's time has expired.
Thank you so much. I yield.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Nelson, I've been very focused on ensuring that the U.S. continues to lead the world in space exploration. And that means American astronauts getting to the moon before China. And I've heard you say before, NASA has partnerships with the private industry. And the other side of me, I'm also interested in making sure that we get the most bang for our buck when it comes to investing in our space exploration. Can you tell me about fixed price contracts with commercial space companies and how they've impacted costs to taxpayers?
Congressman, there are all kind of contracts that we use, and increasingly we're trying to use fixed price contracts. For example, the commercial crew to the space station. Okay, there were two. There was Boeing and there was SpaceX. And an agreement was entered into that each launch, NASA would pay X number of dollars to take a crew of 4 to the International Space Station. That's a fixed price. That fixed price means that if the company overruns those costs, they don't get the cost plus contract. That has been the case with Boeing. As you know, SpaceX has now for 3 years been sending astronauts to the International Space Station, and Boeing has had a series of problems. We are very thankful and hopeful that the first Boeing mission with astronauts is going to occur later this year. But that didn't cost NASA any more money. That was a fixed price contract, so that's a pretty good example.
Yeah, can you quantify the savings on that between the two, or?
Well, I can tell you that Boeing, this is off the top of my head, has spent millions of dollars more over and above what was the price that NASA paid. And the cost of delays after 3 years of delays and having to do extra test flights, it has been substantial. It's a matter of public record. We can get it for you.
So you think you'll be doing more of the fixed price contracts?
As much as we can. Now, a lot of the contracts that we have, you can't shoehorn it into a fixed price because it's a development. It's a exquisite kind of development of a new kind of thing, or rocket or spacecraft, and that you can't all fit into the parameters of a fixed price contract.
Okay. All right. I as a small businessman, I've been sitting over here. I think I got a way to put you into black permanently. I've got a wife and a daughter at home. Backyard, it looks like Swiss cheese because I can't find water to save my life. And you got a satellite that'll find it in the desert.
Yes.
I think we could work something out there. You got a business there.
Well, as a matter of fact, that technology is there, and it can be used.
That's all I got, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Virginia, Congresswoman McClellan.
Thank you.
By the way, Congressman, we employ lots of trucking also on our assets.
Well, that's good to hear. Yes, sir. You're actually in the trucking business in a way.
A different kind of truck.
That's it.
Yes, sir.
Gentleman's time has expired on both ends. The gentlelady's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Administrator Nelson. I am the only member of this committee from Virginia, and I will remind the committee that the manned space flight actually started in Virginia at Langley, the birthplace of the Mercury mission, that most of the leadership for Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo were Langley engineers. That's where Katherine Johnson did the calculations to allow the Mercury astronauts to land safely. This is probably the hearing that I've been looking forward to the most. I was born in, unfortunately, 20-some days after the last Apollo flight, but I grew up watching the space shuttle flights, and I'm very excited that soon my son and daughter will be able to watch us return manned space flight. But Langley Research Center leads hypersonic research for NASA, developing the technology for flight over 5 times the speed of sound. And this is an area of national importance where NASA has valuable expertise and facilities to contribute. And Administrator Nelson, can you discuss NASA's role in hypersonics research and development and how the budget request supports your goals?
Yes, ma'am. We are a science research organization, and as such, we are also an aeronautics organization. That's the first A in NASA. And as a result, we are interested in things going faster in the air, and hypersonics is that. Biggest part of the contracts on hypersonics are in the Department of Defense. But NASA contributes with regard to science research and aeronautics research. So that's how we're involved.
Thank you. I was also excited to see that NASA recently launched the Tropospheric Emission Monitoring of Pollution instrument, which Langley Research Center was involved in developing. This instrument will provide new insight into air quality in North America with neighborhood-level accuracy. What program does NASA have or need to fully utilize this valuable data, including for climate and environmental justice screening applications?
And this is the one about the particulates in the air?
Yes.
Okay. Well, that's particularly a sensitive topic for me right now with all the pollen in the air. And my raspy voice, you can hear part of the result. this mission is going to help us better understand exactly what is happening as we are getting all of these particulates in the air that degrade the quality of our air. We've done that before with some of our instruments, but it is designed to better enhance the quality of the data. And that's what it's going to do.
Thank you.
It's called Tempo.
Yes.
And NOAA will be a partner with us on this.
Great, great. We know that K-12 teachers play an integral role in inspiring students to pursue STEM fields. Can you talk about some of NASA's initiatives to support educators in developing and engaging STEM curriculum for their students?
We have $158 million in the budget request to the Congress for STEM education. It's one of the best tools that we can have, and it's, as we say in the South, it's as easy as falling off a log, because how can you get kids involved in STEM subjects through the subject matter of space? Science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. It is a natural fit. And we utilize our astronauts in their off time to go into schools and talk to kids about this. Needless to say, as you would expect, they're pretty well received when they go in.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I would say if I could get an astronaut to come with me to my son's school, I would get a lot of cool points. So with that, I will yield back my time.
Gentlelady yields back her time, and with the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. McCormick, for 5 minutes.
And thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm really excited to have you here today, Mr. Administrator, and it's an honor. You've lived truly the American dream life. As a naval aviator, as an ER doc, as a logistician, which is kind of like a payload specialist, I was just wondering if you had any guidance on how a congressman might get into outer space. I've heard it's been done before, and I was wondering if, basically, could you help a brother out?
Today, we have a specific kind of astronaut. They have to be all able to go out and do a spacewalk, which was not the case in the past. They have to have technical and scientific training, which you certainly have. And they have to go through a rigorous evaluation. And then once you get through all that, you have to go through the physical and psychological examination. I've had one psychiatric exam in my life, and that was the astronaut psychiatric exam. I used to tell my colleagues over in the Senate, at least I was certifiably sane. So if you're interested in it, let me tell you about an astronaut from Georgia, Sonny Collins. He was terribly, his life was taken from him in a commercial airliner. But Sonny Collins was a medical doctor. He was a professional soccer player. He was a jet pilot. And on top of all that, he became one of the most beloved astronauts in the Corps. And he was taken way too early from us, and he was from Georgia.
What a great tribute. Thank you for that. I'm sure the psych part might be my problem. I still eat crayons from the Marine Corps experience, so I'm not sure how that's going to go. With that said, I wanted to address a more serious topic, which is space debris. We've seen it building over and over the years. We've seen that some nations have actually decided to blow up some things in space and see how it goes. And we've had to actually had avoidance of our own satellites because of that, and it's going to become a bigger and bigger issue. I know there's a lot of different things out there. We've talked about lasers. We've talked about magnets. We've talked about all kinds of things. What do you think the most important, what do you think, do we have a consensus on where we're going with this, or there are new technologies on the horizon? What do you think the best way to handle this is?
We have a consensus in the U.S. That doesn't always help the problem when others on the planet go and do ASAT tests and put up tens of thousands of pieces of space junk that we have to move the space station. Interestingly, both the Russians and the Chinese militaries have conducted those and put up a lot of junk. And yet, we have to do something about it. Now, we're doing the science research on what to do about it. But another way of doing about it is don't do it in the future. Anybody. And so design your rockets such that you can deorbit them in a controlled manner. Design your spacecraft so when it's useless, that you can send it higher into a graveyard orbit and not have it come down in pieces. But everybody's got to do it, and it's a next major problem.
Hopefully we can come to a consensus internationally on that. My final question is basically, who do you think should be in charge? Or do we have an organization that we have eyeing, or do we need to come up with a new organization to be able to manage, kind of like the FAA does for the space, or for the aeronautics, what we're doing in the inner space and even the larger orbital system? What do you think should manage that into the future?
I'm not sure I understand. To manage what?
The traffic. In other words, just like we have air traffic controllers, who's going to manage the conflict of satellites and other space stations and so forth that need to be deconflicted into the future?
If it involves astronauts in space, we're going to be involved. If it is the launching of rockets, the FAA is involved. If it is the managing of space junk, which was your last question, to be determined by the Congress. Where do you want that to be organized and regulated by?
Do you think there should be a central agency that does all that together, or do you think it needs to remain separate? And that's my final question. I apologize for going over.
Separate from what?
Separate from each other. Or should there be one organization that deconflicts all three of them?
Eventually, you're going to have to put it together in something that can manage this totality of all that junk up there.
Thank you. With that,
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Frost, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hello, Administrator. Great to see another Central Floridian here. I grew up with the joy of watching rockets and shuttles fly to the sky over my backyard. Saw the renaissance of our Space Coast thanks to NASA's visionary new missions and public-private partnerships. What role did funding from Congress play in NASA's work in fostering exploration and also the climate-centered work that y'all do?
Everything, Congressman. Without the budgets, we wouldn't have been able to do what we've done.
Yeah. How might your proposed 2024 budget add to that growth of the work that you're doing?
It's essential if we're going back to the moon and on to Mars, and it's essential in our scientific research, our science program, the planetary exploration program, the STEM program. It's essential in everything that we do.
You know, the Artemis program is truly a national effort. The work on its SLS rocket system alone being done in 45 states while supporting over 28,000 jobs. Artemis aims to return Americans to the moon for the first time in over 50 years, develop a sustainable moon base, and prepare for human spaceflight to Mars. It's a very exciting time to be alive. I was just over at Kennedy for the Tempo launch that happened, which was an amazing experience, and I encourage members to make their way down to Florida to catch one of those. What are some of the scientific and practical achievements NASA is hoping for with the Artemis program?
To find out, is there life out there in the universe? So if we get the return samples from Mars, we're going to examine that. We're going to learn how we can go to Mars with humans by going back to the moon, and then we can do our exploration there and beyond. With our telescopes, we're learning all new things about the universe and how big it is and where is there life. As a matter of fact, I ask our scientists, what's the mathematical probability in this universe that is so big, the mathematical probability that there's another middle-sized sun with a middle-sized Earth revolving around it with the right chemical composition? They said at least 1 trillion opportunities that there's another sun and Earth just like ours that would have a habitable atmosphere. At least 1 trillion. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's limitless in this huge, huge universe that we have. This is the exciting stuff that we've been involved in.
Yeah. We can thank our space program for technologies from Velcro to MRIs, and I just want people to remember that this isn't about science for science's sake, but about a government agency that has created much of our modern way of life. In your March letter to the Appropriations Committee, you wrote that if the budget that was passed yesterday, the Republican budget, if they were to get what they want, it would reduce NASA's budget to the 2019 numbers, and it would essentially halt the Artemis program. That would be a massive step back on these important missions. The University of Central Florida in my district has several projects connected to Artemis. They include far out, like developing machinery for mining moon ice, and a rocket that can create its own landing pad, and others just as creative with obvious use at home, like a new fabric inspired by origami, which can repel fine dust. What would such a significant reduction in NASA's budget mean to our research institutions like the University of Central Florida?
It would be devastating. But not only that, if you can't get agreement, and the only agreement that you can get is a continuing resolution at the level of the 23 appropriations, that would have a serious curtailment of a number of our missions.
And, you know, and there's already been funds obviously used for this program. And so if we were to dial back what y'all are asking for, in a sense, would you say that the funds that were given would essentially almost be wasted because of the work that you've put into this already?
Not only that, but the hopes and dreams of a lot of people, not only in America, but all over the world that are our partners.
Yeah. NASA started off as a stuff of dreams, and now Florida has over 16,000 aerospace companies and over 150,000 aerospace jobs. And I support the administrator's full budget request because I want to see our country get the full economic, scientific, and defense benefits of this amazing agency next year and for years to come. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Caston, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Lucas. Administrator Nelson, lovely to see you again here. You know, the SpaceX explosion is in the news, and I don't mean to in any way sound in any way, you know, not serious about it. But I must say, when I first read that, I was getting a chuckle seeing the engineers saying, "This is so exciting how much data we can get out of this explosion." And it was like, once an engineer, always an engineer. There's an opportunity to learn that comes from that, and I'm sure you work with a lot of those folks. It raises the question, though, that I'd love to sort of get your thoughts on. There was Wayne Hale, I'm sure you saw the quote, chairman of NASA Advisory Committee, recently said that NASA should not get tied up in proprietary contracts where they can't release all the details because the taxpayers have a stake and need to know. And, you know, I know a lot of my colleagues have talked about the private companies in their districts. I've certainly got some in mind who make these things, and we want a vibrant private sector. But it feels to me like as NASA outsources not just the private manufacturing of the components, but the whole system design and the integration to a company that ultimately would like to profit from that, there's got to be this tension on how you manage the IP. And so I guess the first question is just, you know, do you agree with Mr. Hale's statement? How do you think about that?
I'm not sure what his statement means, but let me tell you what I believe. In tapping into the ingenuity of the private sector, you want them to be able, since we transfer the technology that we develop to the private sector free, and we want them to have the flexibility of being able to use their creativity, and if it gives them some advantage over a competitor, so be it, if it produces a better product. But when it comes to the safety of astronauts, I guarantee you we are all over it and we know the details. And by the way, the comment about SpaceX, that is SpaceX's modus operandi. They test something, it blows up, it doesn't work, they go figure out what went wrong, they fix it, and they test it again.
Yeah, and I guess, and this is genuine inquiry. I don't mean, if it sounds like a leading question, I don't mean it that way. We, as you mentioned, we do give all this technology we've developed to the private sector, and they're partners. We want to work with them. We're then giving them the taxpayer dollars. And if we were doing that in an in-house operation, there would be no question but that the taxpayer-funded research, whatever that leads to, is owned by the taxpayer, right? And so, you know, as you think about these contracts, of course, they're providing expertise and all the rest of that as well.
And saving the government money, because it's a partnership. It's
yes.
a public-private partnership.
Yes, but there is some trade on the other side there if we don't have access to that IP, right? So in other words, if they were to do that all on their own nickel, that's a different conversation to me. If, you know, if they're doing it on our nickel and, you know, then some point in the future they have something to monetize, well, how do you structure that and what can we do, what should we be doing to think about that problem? Because you've sat on both sides of this dais, right?
Well, let's see what the IP is, and let's see what is the benefit, since we as the government represent the people. And if the goal is space exploration and it helps us get there faster and cheaper, then is that not in the advantage? So we'll have to talk specifics, and I'm happy to respond to a specific about an IP.
Okay. Well, we're getting near the end of the time, but I think of all the technologies that we talk about of having come out of our space program, and an awful lot of those we're not just sending a monkey up into space, you know, microwaves and all these sorts of things. And how do we conceptualize of that? Because we know that we have created a tremendous amount of value for the private sector in America because of that stuff, but we made it publicly available. And if it is taxpayer-funded research, we don't know what the IP is yet, but we know there is intellectual property there. And I think the more, from where I sit, the more that we can make that information publicly available when it is publicly funded, the more we have the opportunity to let thousands of flowers bloom, not just the one we happen to contract with.
So an example would be, I wouldn't have to come begging you all for money if the camera that we developed on a chip that is in every one of your cell phones, if we were getting a certain percent on the sale of that all over the world, we'd have an unlimited federal NASA budget.
And if we could do mark-to-market accounting on our purchase of Manhattan, just imagine how wealthy we'd be.
Gentleman's time has expired, but I would note my colleague makes some very pressing points, and there's actually a caucus in the sub-caucus in the Republican group that may want to talk to you about that. With that, the gentleman yields back, and I recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Kane, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witness, Administrator Nelson. NASA's cooperation with organizations and institutions in the New Jersey has helped promote STEM education and inspire the next generation of scientists and of engineers. By providing access to cutting-edge technologies and programs, these partnerships have prepared students for the careers of tomorrow and help America keep its leading edge. In my own district, the 7th Congressional District in New Jersey, we're proud to have what is now known as Nokia Bell Labs, headquartered here, with amazing innovations and breakthrough technologies are happening to this day. One of these breakthroughs is a partnership between Nokia and NASA to test the first LTE link on the moon. Can you talk to us more about this project and others that will lay the groundwork for Project Artemis and a lunar base? A little bit more detail.
I don't know the specific name of the project, but if you're talking about communications to the moon.
And on the moon. And
say again?
Links on the moon and to the moon, yes.
Well, here's an interesting thing that has happened to us. We're having such a phenomenal success with this James Webb Space Telescope and other things out there that need the deep space network. And so there was actually competing demands on our deep space communication network when we sent Artemis 1 up. The James Webb had to actually concede some time to us. We need that a much more robust communication for all the activities that are going to go in and around the moon. Off the top of my head, I don't know if this is one of them, but if it's communication to the moon, it's generally the area. It's going to need a lot more robust communication. And by the way, part of that we're looking at with laser communication as the way of communicating instead of radio frequency.
Right. China and Russia have announced initial plans to establish an international lunar research station in the mid-2030s. Do you believe China and Russia can successfully cooperate in space?
I think what you better do is get the chairman to get you in a skiff and get you briefed from an intel standpoint on that subject.
Okay. And can you talk a little bit more, therefore, moving on to a little bit more local issue on NASA Space Grant Consortium, talk about how it contributes to various states' STEM education efforts, what you think are the perceived value of the program in terms of advancing NASA's overall goal of inspiring and preparing the next generation of space explorers and innovators?
You just said it better than I could say it. Inspiring and preparing the next generation, not only of space explorers, but as productive American citizens in a high-technology society in the fields of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And what better than the space program to inspire kids to go into those fields?
That's great. Thank you. We yield it back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now enthusiastically turns to the gentleman from New York to perhaps be the final batter in this game.
Well, thanks.
Gentleman from Tonko, Mr. Tonko is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, for the enthusiasm, and thank you and Ranking Member Lofgren for this important hearing. And thank you, Administrator Nelson, for your service to our country and in this latest assignment to ensure that the U.S. provides the leadership in space and scientific discovery. And as my colleagues have highlighted, NASA is indeed critical, not just as a global leader in space exploration, but also for its role in expanding access to education and igniting scientific research and discovery, benefits that are felt right here in our communities and across numerous sectors of our economy. NASA recently announced the next step in its Sustainable Flight Demonstrator project. So, Administrator Nelson, when it comes to sustainable aviation, can you speak briefly about the progress NASA is making in just the has made in just the past year or so in that space?
By sustainable, we are talking about using less resources, making it more environmentally acceptable, using less carbon-based fuels. And so I'll give you two examples. One is electric propulsion, of which in large part the private sector has already exceeded the research that we had started on an electric airplane, because the private sector is starting to produce electric airplanes that will be short haul, usually in an urban area, and short haul, so that you'll have many opportunities other than taxis and trains to get around in basically an urban area. So it could be, electric vehicles that pick you up and fly you to a different part of town, or pick you up and fly you to the next suburb city as a means of transportation. That's one kind of sustainable flight. Another kind of sustainable flight, and we just signed a contract with Boeing as our partner on researching the next major transport to replace the Boeing 737, which is the single aisle medium distance transport, which is by far the heaviest used kind of transport, the equivalent of Airbus and the 737. And what we are experimenting on is a high wing, very thin wing that gives much greater efficiency of the airplane, as well as the improvement to the engine, so that, in effect, the airliner would save 25% of the fuel, be 25% more efficient. Those things are going on right now.
Thank you. And so what are the implications of this NASA-led innovation in sustainable aviation on our economy, on our domestic jobs, global competitiveness in commercial aviation?
It's going to be profound. It could be the most prolific airliner of the future with this kind of design, and the ability to get around without burning fossil fuels, particularly on short-haul flights, and intercity transfer could be just amazing.
Mm-hmm. Earlier, I heard some concerns expressed by some of my colleagues that have highlighted the impacts of proposed budget cuts to NASA in fiscal year 24, and some estimates moving backward to fiscal year 22 funding levels rather than moving forward on a path of discovery and innovation. Is there anything that you would add to earlier discussion in terms of a robust 2024 budget request to enable NASA to accomplish what it needs to accomplish in that aviation sector?
We have a request to the Congress for aviation for our aeronautics research of right at $1 billion. That is the most robust request. And if you all deem it that you are going to grant that request, we're going to have the research that we need.
I thank you. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I want to thank Administrator Nelson for his valuable testimony and members for the questions. Simply note it's a pleasure having you for this budget hearing. Missed it last year, but this will be an ongoing process. And we look forward to working with you in the House and amongst your old colleagues in the Senate and those folks at CBO as we address the real needs of NASA, which is addressing the needs of the country and the future. The record will remain open for 10 days for additional comments and written questions from the members. This hearing is adjourned.